Good morning to everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar, which we've titled Crisis Management for HR Managers. My name is Eoghan O'Herlihy, and I'm an employment partner in Mason Hayes & Curran. Can I introduce my colleagues on this morning's webinar? My employment colleague, Paul Rochford, my partner, Catherine Allen, in our Public and Administrative Law Department, who specialises in data privacy, and my friend and communications consultant, Eoghan McDermott. Eoghan is Managing Director of the Communications Clinic, and he has huge experience in supporting all sorts of organisations in the public sector, the private sector, on all aspects of communications, internal communications, external communications, particularly in crisis situations. So a first question, I suppose, to myself: why have we decided to run this webinar with this title, and why for HR managers? And I suppose the answer really is that a number of our HR clients have told us that in their companies, when a crisis has arisen, they have found themselves brought in by their management or their CEO to assist in trying to manage the crisis. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, obviously, as a HR manager, there may be a HR or an employment aspect to the crisis. So that's an obvious reason for involvement. But it could also be that your CEO trusts your judgment as HR manager, because the CEO will be kind of aware that you deal from time to time with tricky situations, and the CEO wants you involved, or as Eoghan will call it, and he'll explain this later in the webinar, the CEO wants you in the room. Or there may be even a more formal explanation, and that is that you may have done something that we'll talk about during this webinar. You may have done rehearsal for a crisis, and you may be part of, in a formal sense, your company's CMT. And if you don't know what a CMT is, we'll be explaining that as we go along. So the aim of this webinar really is to assist HR managers, and maybe sometimes in-house counsel or people like that who have a responsibility for HR or employment, to deal with a crisis situation in your company. Catherine.
Thanks very much, Ian. So let's get started. Eoghan, what is a crisis?
What is a crisis? Well, a crisis can be fun, it can be stressful, it's interesting and can be high risk. For the people involved in it, it can often be a bonding experience. It can be career defining, and unfortunately at times it can be career ending. I think were you to look at the general definition of what a crisis is, it'd say it is a time of intense difficulty, challenge, or danger. And usually for organizations, and for many of us, it'll come out of the blue, which again, in and of itself, is challenging. Myself and my colleagues would have supported a plethora of clients through a plethora of issues. Now, those issues could be HR challenges, dealing with whistleblowers, dealing with job losses, product recalls, rat infestations, accidents at manufacturing plants, toxic spills. It could be sports people being involved in an altercation or being accused of taking illicit drugs. For example, we supported an organization after its president was arrested by a foreign police force. And two notable ones that I'm able to talk about, given that they were FOI'd, or freedom of information, and they were in the public domain. About 20 years ago, one of the founders of our organization, Tom Savage, helped the Department of Health when the Department of Health had given a polio vaccine to 10,000 or tens of thousands of children, in fact, that appeared to have some variant of CJD from the donor and from the serum from the donor. So there was a risk at times that the government and the state had injected our children with mad cow disease. So Tom helped the department navigate that. More recently, myself and my colleagues have supported the Department of Education and the Minister through the issue with the algorithm and the Leaving Cert that you might remember happened a month or so ago. But if you look at those different scenarios, from the spill to the technology failure, there are common principles that we can extrapolate from them. part of the reason, and this is the first thing, part of the reason that organizations and people find crisis so stressful is the lack of familiarity with the situation. Also, obviously, the loss of face and the loss of job and the loss of reputation is a risk, but the lack of familiarity is the big one. So a few things to remember. You should be encouraging your organization to have a team identified to manage the crisis. You should ensure that there's a devil's advocate in the room, somebody who is confident enough to ask why. Why did this happen? But in particular, also confident to ask, why are we deciding to follow a specific course of action? That's important. And I would also suggest what will make a crisis a smidgen less stressful is that the scenario planning has been carried out in advance and that you and your team have developed a checklist of the important things that need to be addressed. And we can chat about those a little later on. But they are the things that I'd be asking you to consider. You can plan for it, you can think it through, and you can get the right people in the room.
Okay, thanks very much, Eoghan. We will come back to the vital issue of communications in a crisis, both internal and external communication. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to Ian and Paul to discuss some issues. Paul, if I could turn to you first, suppose a senior executive has stolen or appears to have stolen €500,000 from a company. Can and should that person immediately be suspended?
Thanks for that question, Catherine, and good morning to everybody. Well, I think that set of facts would probably come within any business's definition of a crisis, as set out by Eoghan there. And historically, I think, you know, most HR people on this call would have been, if something like that happened, would be expecting someone to storm into their office and say, we have to get rid of this person immediately, get them out the door now. And historically, that would have been what would have happened. The situation is different now based on the law that we have at the moment. And the courts considered this a number of years ago in the Riley decision and looked at the circumstances where it might be justifiable to suspend somebody. And in that case, it was because the employee had challenged that decision to suspend him on the basis that it might cause irreparable damage to his reputation. And that is certainly consideration, particularly dealing with more senior employees within an organization. And what the court said is that you can't just suspend as a knee-jerk reaction. You have to give consideration to that decision. And the factors that feed into that are, you know, is it necessary in order to progress an investigation into the issues that are alleged? And in making that decision as to whether or not it's necessary, the court pointed out a number of things that you should look at. So is a suspension required to prevent a reoccurrence of the activity or the offence that's alleged? Is suspension required to prevent interference with evidence that might be required as part of the investigation into that alleged offence? Or if in the case of something involving interactions between people within the workplace, is it necessary to protect the rights of the other people that are involved? And those three decision points are all relatively discrete and might be relatively straightforward in most circumstances. But there's a fourth one the court identified, and this is probably more pertinent to today's discussion. And the court said that you can also make that decision to suspend pending investigation to protect your business or the business's reputation. And that is somewhat more of a nuanced consideration, and one that probably is the one that will arise most often, it has to be said. You know, because once you know about something, particularly a theft like that, it might be relatively easy or somewhat straightforward to shut down the capacity for reoccurrence or interference with evidence. But you might have a consideration about the reputation of the business where perhaps a senior executive has been alleged to have made off with a large sum of money. And what's the impact of that on our stakeholders? So be that the shareholders in the business, be that the customers, be that the wider reputational existence of the organization within the public. And you know, Eoghan will touch on this later on in terms of the issue and the perhaps the friction between what might be the legal position in relation to suspension, whether legally it's a sound thing to do, and whether reputationally it's a sound thing to do or not to do, as the case may be. So that's the message to take away is it's not a straightforward, immediate reaction. It has to be considered, and it has to, the decision matrix for it has to be documented so that you can stand over it later on.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And could I stay with that example for a moment and ask you whether there are any reporting obligations that a company needs to consider in that scenario? For example, what about reporting to An Garda Síochána in that situation?
Yeah, so I mean, where there is something alleged that might be a criminal offence, you might consider that you've a general kind of civic duty to report that to the Gardaí, and that can arise in a lot of different circumstances. But there are actually relatively few positive obligations to report offences to the Gardaí, which if you don't can create difficulty for you. And this is one of them. So the Criminal Justice Act 2011, Section 19 of that Act places a positive obligation to report wrongdoings that are enumerated in the Act. So they're set out in the piece of legislation itself, and they include things like theft or fraud, money laundering, or other banking or financial wrongdoings. And it was widely regarded that that piece of legislation was brought in to deal with what was loosely termed as white collar crime, for want of a better term. So that does create a positive obligation on you to report it. And if you don't, the failure to report in itself is an offence. So straightforward, you would think, but not quite, because the criteria the legislation sets out is where you have knowledge or a belief that might lead to either the disclosure of an offence or the investigation, prosecution or apprehension of a person who's alleged to have committed that offence. So the decision that you have to make is, I have a concern here. When does that concern cross over into something else, into something that might constitute knowledge or belief? And then there may be other, outside of this specific example, there may be other occasions whereby you have a positive obligation. So for example, one fairly clear one is where you're dealing with childcare or care of vulnerable adults. You will also have positive statutory obligations to report certain wrongdoings in those situations as well.
Paul, can I butt in there for a second? And you and I dealt with a case last year where there was a large-scale theft in an organization by a senior person. And when the person was confronted in the workplace with the issue, he burst into tears and admitted the offence. What bearing do you think that would have on, if you like, the obligation to report to the Gardaí?
I think in that circumstance, then you could probably fairly safely regard yourself as having knowledge or a strong belief that the relevant offence has been committed. There's a world of difference, and anybody on the webinar this morning who has any experience of criminal law probably would say there's a world of difference in that admission to you in the context of that discussion and what might constitute admission for the purposes of the criminal offence. But for the purposes of your consideration under the 2011 Act, you probably cross the threshold there into something that constitutes knowledge or belief. But again, that line of decision, and this is again maybe something that Eoghan can touch on later or will come relevant as part of the discussion later. There is a decision there where it may be very much on the line, and you have to consider, not only do I have the consideration of it may be a criminal offence not to report this, but even if I'm not quite over the line, if I have reasonable suspicion that I'm close to it and I don't report it, even if I escape the element of the criminal offence for not reporting it, reputationally, and as part of the consideration of my communications around this, is that the right course of action? So it's not an easy decision and it's not straightforward, but it is something to bear in mind, particularly in those particular sectors that piece of legislation applies to.
Thanks, Paul. Could I stay with the issue of reporting for the moment and consider or raise the question whether there could be other reporting obligations in other scenarios, a fatal accident, for instance, or where a product is found to be dangerous?
There certainly are, Catherine, and perhaps the widest one touches on the example you gave there, which is the Health and Safety Authority. So in the case of fatal accidents, obviously there's an immediate reporting obligation to the Health and Safety Authority. There are also reporting obligations where you have non-fatal accidents or other specified events that happen in the workplace, for example, that cause injury or loss. So, for example, a malfunction of some form of machinery, or a collapse of a part of a building, or, for example, the issue of a particular substance into the environment inadvertently that may cause harm or damage. So those are all set out, and they're all specified events that you're required to report, and there's a 10-day reporting period for those non-fatal ones. Then that's the widest one. You then may have very specific ones. So in the instance of the last example there I gave of some sort of leak of a substance into the environment, you may also have a requirement to report to the Environmental Protection Agency. If you're in the food business, you may have an obligation to report issues with a particular food product to the Food Safety Authority. In the childcare sector, as well as any obligations to report matters to the Gardaí, you may also have a statutory obligation to report matters to the Child and Family Agency. So depending on the sector you're in, it's very important to be aware of this. You may have a specific obligation. If you're not already aware of it, go and check today, as part of your preparation for this. But it is important to be aware as part of dealing with an issue that arises, as well as those people that I may want to talk to, and Eoghan will talk about that now shortly. There may be people that I have to talk to in the immediate term, and I need to know who those are.
Catherine, can I ask you a question, just butt in there for a moment? You work a lot in the area of sort of data privacy. Suppose there's a serious breach in one of your client companies. Customers' data has been accessed by third parties. Maybe it's a result of a cyber attack, so-called. So my understanding is that the DPC needs to be informed pretty quickly. Can you clarify the position around that?
Yes, Ian, you're absolutely right. There is an obligation to report personal data breaches to the Data Protection Commission within 72 hours, in fact, of becoming aware of the breach, which is a very short time frame. And if you don't report within the 72 hours, you have to explain why you haven't reported within the 72 hours. And I know this is timing is an issue that we're going to come back to shortly, but just around this particular obligation, generally our advice tends to be that you should make at least a limited form of report within the 72 hours, even if you haven't completed your investigation into the matter, so that you are in compliance with that deadline, and follow up with subsequent reports afterwards. That is a better approach to take than waiting until you have all of the information to hand and being outside that deadline of 72 hours to report. So that's a very good example, Ian. Yes.
Thanks, Catherine. And I do recall an issue that we had some time ago, an extraordinary issue, really. A client who, by an extraordinary mistake, had sent out sensitive personal data on a difficult staff member with whom there were HR problems, complaints from her, complaints against her, etc., and had sent out that staff member's sensitive personal data comprising, including medical records, medical assessments, and this had gone out by accident to a large, not a very large, but a considerable number of clients, of customers. So really, really kind of a serious matter. And the only reason I relate it is it just struck me as an example that sometimes when you do the right thing, you can get lucky. So what we did with this client, we were aware that the data subject, so-called, the staff member had been informed, and she had responded with horror, understandably. And she said, I'm immediately going to my solicitor. So what we had advised the client to do was to make a kind of an immediate preliminary report, one that you just referred to the DPC. And we rang the DPC with the client and spoke, and the Commissioner's office was alarmed at the seriousness of it, but at least we rang. But the reason we got lucky was 20 minutes later, the solicitor for the staff member rang the Data Commissioner's office to report this serious breach. And by luck, from my client's point of view, got put through to the very same individual in the DPC's office that we had just spoken to. And that individual was able to answer the solicitor I know all about this. The employer has been on to me and has explained on to me, and it changed completely the dynamic, because had the solicitor informed the DPC's office before we got to it, we feel, and you have a lot of experience of this, there would have been a very different dynamic with the DPC's office. So sometimes you do the right thing, sometimes you get lucky, you know.
Yes, indeed. That's very fortuitous. Eoghan, if I could bring you back into the conversation now, could I ask you to share some of your experience and expertise around communicating in a crisis? And listening to Paul and Ian's responses there, are there common themes that we can draw out from the scenarios that they have just touched upon?
There absolutely are, absolutely. And the last point that Ian made, for example, on doing the right thing, I think doing the right thing is the best policy, and that often I would find it very difficult for anybody to find themselves being criticized for doing the right thing. I think the second thing is that every company and every organization should know who their audiences or stakeholders are. So for example, from staff to clients, suppliers, investors, the regulator, perhaps a state body that you would need to contact, perhaps media. The reason why I would say perhaps media is that a mistake that people make is that they often believe media to be an audience, or they believe that the general public could be an audience when they're actually not. So they engage with media, and all that does is create a bigger story than there ever was. So I would be suggesting everybody leaving here and leaving this webinar sets themselves a task to say, do we have a fairly good understanding and a handle on who our stakeholders and whatever the crisis may be that we would need to consider communicating with? The second piece that's touched on there, though, it's reiterating the point, and I hope is a message that comes through from this, is that scenarios are plannable for. For example, we work with a developer and builder on their crisis management and the communication around that. They know, for example, that they have a far higher chance of having a fatal accident on their site. So what they look at then are, well, who are the key people we need to talk to? Well, you would say the family of the person who has unfortunately died. Who's going to be the person that contacts the family? Who's going to talk to the staff and their colleagues on site who may be traumatized by this? Do we have a social media policy, for example, to stop people tweeting or putting up on Facebook or putting up on Instagram what has happened on site? And having those things considered, again, makes the management of the crisis far easier. To give you another example that was ventilated, or an issue was ventilated when we were doing a run through with an NGO during the summer, where we role played or scenario played out the kidnapping of one of their staff in one of the locations internationally that they were working in. What was interesting in that case was they forgot to contact the family of the kidnapped in the dry run. Now you would say, gosh, that had never happened in real life, but it happened in the dry run. So it'll never happen to them again. But having those issues ventilated, I think, is a worthwhile thing. Also, though, and it's linked again to the element on the reporting and the time, and the issue that you raised, Catherine, and particularly with the Data Protection Commissioner of you're at 72 hours. I would argue you do need to know the time and the time frames that you have to abide by when you start to communicate, because the clock has really started ticking, and you're dead right. You don't want it ticking off from whoever the regulator or state body is for missing that deadline. So having a good handle on the timelines that you are against makes it, again, an easier thing to manage. Because if you do appreciate that you have 72 hours to work with, well, one could argue that's the working week you have to work. Now, you might be working night and day, but it is a useful thing to have a handle on what time is allowed to you.
Okay, thanks, Eoghan. What would you say is the biggest myth around communications in a crisis?
I'd say the greatest myth, it's linked a little bit to what I've just been talking about, but the greatest myth is actually that there's a prize for speed. There isn't really. Often fast actions tend to be risky actions. I would much rather you to be slow and correct rather than fast and wrong. Crises tend to get the adrenaline going. People get a buzz out of them and they want to seem really active, you know, so they'll have watched episodes of The West Wing or The Thick of It, and they see people running around doing stuff. I would be suggesting you need a calm head in there, and that's part of the reason why people who work in HR are particularly useful in that scenario. But you do need to have a calm head. You do need not to rush any of the decisions, because the adrenaline that's going tends to lead people to making fast and significant communications decisions. many of which, when you review it, subsequently turn out to be wrong. So you will tend to see the biggest mistake organizations make is they stick someone out on media far sooner than they needed to, and then the person doesn't have the answers to the obvious questions. I would argue, for example, again, if you were to take the radio case study, it only takes Morning Ireland 5 seconds to say a person from X organization was unavailable to comment. Now, people say that's very embarrassing, but I would much rather 5 seconds of that rather than 10 minutes of a representative of your organization getting battered on media by one of them being asked all of the questions that they simply don't have the answer to and making the situation worse. So regarding communications in a crisis, remember this: don't just do something, stand there. The bravest course of action in a crisis is, in fact, to sit and assess and to see where you're at. Most crises get exacerbated because people rush into action. And you may find, and you better not be the person doing it, but you maybe find that you'll be plaguing, or people will be plagued, saying, we need to tell customers X, we need to be telling our staff Y, we need to go out on media and say Z. I would argue you don't just do something, you stand there. Get a handle on what the issue is, figure out what the underlying problem is, and then look at the communication. When we run exercises in crisis communication, we find it interesting that people feel, even in those, huge pressure when they're told a journalist is looking to speak to them. Don't allow yourself or don't allow a colleague get pressured into that. And there's a line that I quote from a movie called Glengarry Glen Ross, a famous play as well, by Ricky Roman. If you've seen the movie, Ricky Roman was Al Pacino, where he says, you never open your mouth until you know what the shot is. That principle that says, don't say anything until you know for sure is really important. So get your facts straight. What happened? Where? Why? How? Who? Because if you're finding that your organization has to correct previously given information, it's going to be a situation where the boy who cried wolf. Journalists, your audiences, your stakeholders will never believe you again. Everything that you said gets called into action, and then they'll begin to look for other sources. So if you're handling communication in a crisis right, you should be the primary source of the information in that crisis. So for example, if you take the example that I cited around the Department of Education and the algorithm, the minister in that instance found out about it on the Tuesday evening, but didn't say anything about it publicly until the following week. Now, part of their initial strategy was to go out later in the week, but when we asked the obvious questions, what happened? Why did it happen? How many students were affected by it? What are the implications to the results? What does this mean for their college choices? None of those questions were able to be answered initially. So going out on media 2 days later would have been fatal. But holding it off, gathering the information, taking your time, getting to the bottom of things, I think is certainly a task that you should all be doing. And remember, don't just do something, stand there.
And one thing, Owen, that I've learned from working with you is one trick of media correspondence is, to send in a message to an organization. I'm running a story on blah, and I have a deadline of 5 p.m. on Wednesday for a statement from you. So can you let me have a statement by then? And you have always taken the line, that's their deadline. It's not necessarily the company's deadline. So, don't be dictated to by a media deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when any of us get contacted by a journalist out of the blue, there is a sense of trepidation, there is a sense of nervousness, and then there is the inexperience that people might have of dealing with journalists, which then, because they have contacted them, you feel obliged to answer them. So I think you're absolutely right, Ian, that it is not your deadline, it's their deadline, so work around it. Also, the mistake that people can make is they will then therefore answer the questions presented to them like it is an exam and they're being the best student in the class. I would then again suggest, if you decide to talk to media, you don't necessarily need to follow the pattern of questions that they have asked. You can simply give them the response that you ideally would like to see in media afterwards.
Thanks, Eoghan. How do you manage social media in that context?
I'd love to say I have the answer, but I don't really. And I don't mean to disappoint people, but social media is tricky. It's the Wild West. At least a journalist and their publications have some standards that they need to maintain. Whereas anybody would know, social media, Twitter in particular, anybody anywhere can say whatever they want about you. So it's very difficult to manage it. And a really simple principle is to actually keep your head down. To use the witch hunt analogy, in a witch hunt, nobody listens to the person being hunted when they say, I'm not a witch. When they've decided you're a witch, you're getting burned no matter what. And that actually what you have to do is perhaps keep your head down and hope for the storm to pass, to mix my metaphors terribly. And that's the hardest thing, is to sit tight, keep the head down. And when the storm has passed, to survey what damage, if any, has been done. And when you've assessed that, you can then start the plan to rebuild maybe your personal reputation or the reputation of your organization.
Eoghan, you and I dealt with an employer during the summer who was being really attacked on social media and basically being accused of being a racist. And this all got weirdly caught up with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. So this Irish employer was suddenly now being commented on social media all around the US, which was kind of bizarre. And I distinctly remember you and I engaging with, if you like, the managing director, who was extremely anxious, desperate indeed, to make a statement. You might share with us, if you like, the line we took on that, which was actually very successful at the end of the day, but maybe you might share the line we took on that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that, it is great in hindsight to say what we suggested worked out, because every action and decision has an element of risk to it. It was a point I should have mentioned on the social media. Social media tends to follow a cycle of about 4 days, and it burns at its brightest around day 2, still into day 3, and starts to fizzle out around day 4. So that's just worth noting in the social media, because this particular person we were dealing with was in the middle of it when we encountered them. Also, with the time zone lag in the US, it did make it feel like it was continuous, not just in Ireland, but through the night in America. It's worth adding in a bit of context as well to this, Ian. The person we were dealing with was close to the end of their career and was worried that this was going to be their legacy. So it was very personally damaging. They were also sure themselves that they weren't a racist. And they were also at the time being alerted by everybody who had ever met them that they were trending. Not only were they being alerted by everybody who had ever met them that they were trending, they were also getting advice from left, right, and center. Things like, you really need to get your side of the story out. You really need to get your point out there. You need to tell them that you're not a racist. So they were getting all of this advice through it. We came in and we were lucky that we didn't have necessarily the emotional connection with it. We weren't really feeling our careers were at risk. So that gave us the chance to look at it objectively. So there was a few things to it. The accusations online, our client said were untrue. But aside from that, they were unverified and they hadn't been double checked. A journalist had gotten in touch with our client looking for them to comment on the accusations online. Now, this was a crucial point because the comments weren't evidenced and they weren't sure, the journalist couldn't really cover them unless our person made a comment, even denying them. So if our client had said, well, I deny any accusations of being a racist, the journalist could say, person X, in response to accusations online, says they weren't a racist. That would have added color and content for the article. Also, back to the point about the media and the social media storm, it was around day 2 in the evening, I think it was a Tuesday evening, and we figured it was going to be still burning bright the next morning, but was going to start fizzling out a little bit. So we estimated they had another 24 to 36 hours to go. So if they could keep their head down and not make any comment, that wouldn't add any fuel to the fire. That was another logic. There was also a piece where there was more interesting stuff going on. Donald Trump was putting members of his defense forces out on the street to manage the Black Lives Matter movement. And our government were making comments about COVID-19 and some of the restrictions. So there was other stuff going on that was a little bit more interesting. So again, our advice to the client was, any utterance that you make will make this more interesting and you don't want to do it. So in the end, we advised them not to say anything. Thankfully, it fizzled out, and thankfully, it has been really forgotten about. our worry was that they would have added to it and it would have become a they said argument, and it was very, very difficult to evidence that they weren't a racist. To give you another quick example before I move off, because there are times where you can make the call to say something. To give you another very quick example, a while ago, I was contacted by a well-known person on a Sunday morning. They had begun to see accusations of them that morning, suggesting that the night before, the Saturday night, that they had taken cocaine in a particular bar, and there was video footage of them. The video footage was grainy and unclear, but it was them picking up something that could be argued was a bag of cocaine and then going off to the toilet. The person who rang me was adamant that they hadn't taken cocaine and this was false, and they were very worried of the reputational damage. I would then, and it's back actually a little bit to the timing, they had a window where they could get a drugs test that was verifiable and that could prove, if they were telling the truth, that they hadn't taken cocaine. So my advice to them was, you need to go get a drugs test by an independent healthcare professional to prove this. They did it. They hadn't taken cocaine, or certainly cocaine wasn't in their system, but they hadn't taken cocaine, and they had the evidence that they could say, look, here is the proof. They handed it to their lawyers and the rest was history. But there is a contrast with that where they could have the piece of paper from a third party waving it saying, I did not do the thing, whereas our person who was accused of the racism struggled a little bit around that. Also on the timing, there was a window that they had to get that done by. And I think there's a couple of those pieces around it. So I would again encourage people not to rush, but if you can get to the bottom of something quickly, and if you can get the evidence to prove it, you then can intervene in quite a timely way.
Thanks, Eoghan. You mentioned a little earlier about repairing reputation. What is your view on apologies in that context?
Oh, well, I think if you've done something wrong, you should apologize, and it should be a proper apology. And I'd be interested really to get your view, the solicitor, a legal view on this, because at times this is where a tension can arise in the room, as I call it, between the communications people and the legal people on this. My view is you have to make an apology, and it has to be a full apology. It can't be any of the conditional apologies that we're hearing of late. I'm sorry if you felt offended by what I said, or I'm sorry if you have felt damaged by what I have done. None of those apologies wash. People see through them and they are ineffective and they're not real apologies. I even think if people can think of the what we're seeing currently with the RTE stars and the apologies that they're being asked to make following the lack of practicing social distancing. They're doing pretty good apologies and they're looking pretty depressed and upset about it. So you can see that they're really feeling the sadness and the apology that they're making. Contrast that with Phil Hogan back in Golfgate. It took Phil 2 statements to say he was sorry, and it took Phil 3 statements to actually make the apology work. And that again contributed to the bit of momentum against him, which could be difficult. So I actually have a model and approach that I would suggest people try and apply when making an apology that I believe works. It works, believe it or not, at home as much as it works in a professional context if you have ever made a mistake. But I call it the 4 A's. I think Harvard and Stanford's, or one of them said there were 6 elements to the perfect apology, but there's too many to remember. So apply the 4 A's. The first A is apologize. The second A is acknowledge. The third A is attend. So you have to wallow in it. And the fourth A is act. So apologize, acknowledge what you did wrong, attend, wallow in it, don't rush, and then act. What are you going to do to fix it? I think from a communications perspective, that's crucial to giving you the opportunity to rebuild your reputation, particularly if you've made a mistake. But as I said, that's our view of things. I would be interested because I do know there can be implications from a legal perspective on a certain apology.
Paul, would you like to comment there from the legal perspective?
I think so, yeah, and I know there are a few in-house counsel on the webinar this morning. They're probably equally kind of grimacing at the thought of that. You know, and most lawyers would say, like, God, for the love of God, don't acknowledge any fault or any responsibility, because you'll damage your prospects of defending any subsequent claim. But I think this goes back to the point we were making earlier about the decision to suspend or not, and you have perhaps 2 pieces of advice from within your organization or advisors to your organization. You have one sitting on one side of the table saying, look, you've done something here, you need to make an apology in order to protect the business's reputation. And you have me or Ian or you, Catherine, sitting on the other side going, well, if you do that, here are the legal implications of that, and here's where you may be openly admitting liability for a particular act. And that is the difficult decision that organizations are going to have to come down to sometimes. And there are no risk scenarios. So there's always some risk attached to every decision you make in a crisis. And you have to determine what is the priority here in terms of assessing those risks and putting them in order. And am I more concerned with protecting the reputation of the business and stemming the bleeding on that side? And I'll deal with the potential liability that may arise if there is a claim later. I'll deal with that later. Or because of the nature of the thing that's gone wrong, it would, admitting liability in some way, perhaps destroy the business financially because of the implications of a potential successful claim on that front. So I'll just have to wear the reputational damage. So there are no easy answers. We don't have them, and they're very much fact dependent. But be aware there are tough decisions to be made, and that's why it's called a crisis. So you have to be ready to make those.
Indeed.
I think, Catherine, it's also worth saying that a phrase that we use all the time in these situations is that there is no risk option often available, and that's just backing up what Paul is going to say. One thing is worth bearing in mind, that is, you may have your company's insurers in the background, and they may have to be consulted. And I have been pleasantly surprised on behalf of clients in this sort of situation, where the insurers have recognized that, an apology may actually facilitate, in the wider sense, a resolution of the matter, rather than no statement at all, or worse still, a denial, when in fact the facts point to wrongdoing. So, a sophisticated approach needs to be taken.
Thanks, Ian. Eoghan, a final question for you. Are there any absolute don'ts in crisis communications?
Yeah, this one might be self-evident, but sometimes it needs to be said, which is don't lie, that you have to tell the truth, because obviously, ultimately telling the truth is the honest thing to do, but you'll eventually get found out as an aside. So that'd be the first one. I would say don't minimize the wrongdoing by trying to call it a mistake or shirk responsibility. And this is linked a little bit to what the guys have been talking about, but our argument would be you take responsibility. If you've done something wrong, say so, and that gives you an opportunity to move on. I'd also recommend people not to do PR. So don't do PR in the middle of a crisis. In the middle of a scandal, don't start telling people how many people you employ or how good your CSR program is. Or if, for example, you're a renewable energy company and a turbine has decapitated 2 farmers or 14 sheep, I don't think there is the time to start telling people that you provide the village that they're from with cheap electricity. So the rule there is don't do PR. So I think they would be the don'ts. I think a key point that I would like to make is that if you have thought these through and if they are possible, they are therefore plannable for. It is worth being able to know who your key stakeholders are and who your key audiences are and what are the best ways of communicating with them. Try and get a team together, a team of trusted people who aren't just there as yes people, but who have the capacity of questioning, of saying, why are we taking this course of action? Why are we doing this? And because we should, or because we need to get ahead of it, are not decent reasons. There has to be an objective to it. And I think if those things considered and not rush it and understand trying to get to the bottom of things is a good policy, that can at least help in some way the management of a crisis.
Thank you very much, Eoghan. Ian, Eoghan spoke about preparation for a crisis. Any specific suggestions from your angle to conclude?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd make a reflection, and that is that having dealt with a considerable number of clients facing a crisis like the kind of ones we've been speaking about, there is a world of a difference in dealing with a company that has no preparation done and one that has. I mean, there's 2 ends of a spectrum, I suppose. One, you have an organization which is simply turned upside down by a situation. People are in a panic. The media are knocking on the door. I often say, you know, the response itself is a crisis, which is not where you want to be. At the other end of the spectrum, you know, you have an organization which has done some preparation, has adopted a plan, I said I'd explain the old CMT, has a crisis management team appointed, has roles allocated, and has, you know, has rehearsal done. And the two are really like chalk and cheese. But in reality, I suppose most companies, most clients are somewhere in between those. So, I mean, just picking up on something that Eoghan has said, you know, what would we be recommending that a company, a client company does? Well, you should have some sort of a plan. If you don't have a plan in a crisis, you're in difficulties. You should have some sort of a plan or a policy. And, you know, plans or policies deal with fairly standard stuff, you know, identifying potential risks, identifying potential business impacts from those risks, appointing a crisis management team, training in advance so each of the team members knows what their role is, you know, dealing with internal communications, external communications, even having a list of relevant contact people and contact details for external people like we've been spoken about now. You know, that's all sort of bog standard planning. You also need rehearsal. And, you know, we often laugh because we say every single employer in the country who has a premises is familiar with the fire drill. Employees they have mock fire drills. But I mean, you have to ask yourself, how many companies actually have a fire in their premises compared to the much larger number of companies that have some sort of a crisis at some stage or other? I'd suggest to you, crises are far more common than fires. So the message really is, you know, prepare, rehearse. So, I mean, just to finish and say that if we in Mason Hayes and Curran, or indeed Eoghan in the communications clinic, if we can help with planning, with drawing up a plan or a policy, with rehearsal, with training or support, anything like that, we'd be delighted to do so. Otherwise, I suppose I'd just like to say good morning to everybody who's listened in today. Thank you for joining the webinar, and we all hope you've found it helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.